Hello, everyone. Today I have the beautiful, wonderful Alicia Guzman here with me to talk about reading translated works of fiction and the value in that, because Alicia started a wonderful book club called the Lit in Translation Book Club. I'm going to be joining her this month to discuss Vita Nostra. The live show for that will be on April 23rd on her channel. And I think the time we decided for that is 2 p.m. EST, if I'm not mistaken. But today we're just going to be talking about why you should read translated literature, or if you should, and just some of the conversation around this discussion, because I know that I've seen some people being a little bit hesitant about this topic. So first of all, Alicia, would you mind sharing a little bit about your channel and about this book club?
Yeah, I would love to. Thank you. So my name is Alicia Guzman, and I started my channel a little bit over a year ago, actually now. And I've always read translated fiction since I first started really getting into reading and literature. And I strayed a little bit away from reading translated literature for a while, especially with YouTube, because you get really excited about new releases and what everybody's picking up. And at the time, I stopped reading for maybe 4 or 5 years. And I just really wanted to get back into the swing of things, reading things. But then I slowly started to make my way back to translated literature. And it was a pull for me because there's just so many varied perspectives for me that I enjoy while reading translated literature. And even now that I've dabbled in other genres like fantasy, in the English, or American and British, and just like n- n- like fantasy that's not really translated, I see differences with other texts that I've read that are translated. So I started a book club to help people, or for me to encourage people to read translated literature and to fall in love with it just the way that I did. And I really hope that y'all join. I did only make it so that it's 10 months out of the year because I know people get busy during November, December. So it'll run for 10 months, but I'm really excited and I hope y'all join.
Yeah, fantastic. And I think it's worth mentioning too, you're bilingual, correct? You speak both Spanish and English. Are there any other languages that you speak as well?
Not fluently. So fluently, I only speak Spanish and English, and Spanish is actually my first language.
Fantastic. Do you read it in Spanish as well, or do you primarily, well, I know you read other obviously translated works, but do you read in Spanish as well?
I don't read in Spanish as much as I used to nowadays. English became my primary language, and it's the one that I'm most comfortable reading just because I have lost a lot of vocabulary over the years in Spanish. And part of my enjoyment of reading, especially when I read translated fiction, is being able to understand it. When I read in Spanish now, I tried tackling 100 Years of Solitude a couple of months ago, maybe almost a year ago in Spanish. And there was just so much vocabulary that I didn't know. I had to sit with a dictionary on the side or with my phone to Google things. And I realized that that was really taking me out of the story. So I have to go back and read young adult books first in Spanish before I get into more classical works. But it is something that I do want to continue to do, read in Spanish and in English. It's just something I have to work my way up to.
Yeah, that's so neat. I really admire that people, well, one, I admire you for being able to be bilingual, to be able to speak in both Spanish and English fluently. It's also just a whole other thing, I think, to be able to speak or to be able to read in other languages as well. So I was just curious about that too. And I was curious about that especially because I know that there are some people who are probably hesitant when it comes to translated works because I know for me, a couple of things made me a little bit hesitant about it. And one is that although I'm not bilingual, I did grow up in a Hispanic household. I am Hispanic. And
Yeah.
I know that a lot of times when I talk about translations, Spanish translations with my mother, who speaks fluently in both languages, she would always speak the line in Spanish And then she would say, this doesn't really translate well to English. Like she would always say there were certain sayings and things like that that don't translate as well to English. And I just wonder if you feel like that's ever been an issue for you with any translated work, or yeah, just some ideas about that, about working, navigating with those different kinds of like colloquialisms or sayings and things like that.
Yeah, and I think that's a really excellent point that you bring up. Sometimes when you translate literature, it's not going to be a direct translation. And especially with translators taking, some may take their own liberties. And actually, I would love to speak to a translator one day as well. How much of your own voice you put into a translation, or how much liberty are you given to try not to modify the text, but to try to not have a direct translation that gives a more closer meaning, right? Because whenever someone writes, even if you're a translator, you're putting a little bit of your own voice and your own tone to a text. So, yes, definitely. I think that some ideas, some direct sentences have no direct translation, but there might be a way to still preserve the meaning either by explaining it a little bit more or by your putting your own interpretation into it. And one of the things that I think about as well with translated literature is that we often think, or at least a lot of the people that I speak to, think of translated literature from other languages into our own, but we don't ever really think about fiction that's translated from English to other languages. And I just think it's fantastic how we're able to be unified by one book that may be like very, very instilled in our culture, like Lord of the Rings, right? It's been translated to so many different languages. And I'm sure that we don't get all of the meaning and the direct translation, but the story as a whole is still there. The characters are still there. And we are able to unify around this. And it's ultimately about the meaning of the story in my head and not necessarily about every single line and every single sentence.
I love that you said that. I think that's beautifully said because there are tons of people from other countries who read either Lord of the Rings or Harry Potter or whatever their starting point was in the literature in a different
Yeah.
language than English. And maybe they speak English as well. And maybe they read both translations or just one. But either way, the feeling, the understanding of those stories is universal. So you could find people who maybe read the translation but they still connected to the stories in a heartfelt way. I think just as the stories live in them just as much as somebody who read the story in English. So that's such a good point. Yeah.
Exactly. And that's something that I've been thinking a little bit more about now when I'm trying to read literature from a variety of different languages. And I think about some countries that I don't want to say excluded, but just haven't come to mind of, hey, I want to read literature from this language, from this country, but they speak English. And even though it's not translated, there's still works that portray their culture or their history. And I'm sure that it's being translated into a different language.
Yeah. And that's also, I also want to respond to what you were saying too about the translator and how much work the translator puts into their work as well. Because I know when I used to sing a lot of repertoire and when I was a singer, when I was performing a lot, and I sang a lot of songs in other languages, a lot of times our requirement was to make sure that even if we didn't know the language, that we would translate every single word. And you can find songs in other languages that have the word to word translation. And then you
Mhm.
can find the sort of translation for singing in English. And there is going to be changes. There are going to be changes, obviously, than if you read the word to word translation. It would just be totally different. And you could see so it's just seeing just how different those two things are side by side, the word to word translation versus somebody rewriting the translation to make it singable. Of course, you have the music component with that, but it's kind of
Yeah.
similar, I would think, in storytelling that you want to make it make sense and make it sort of elicit the same sentiment, same emotion, same idea, in an understandable way. And so I think it has to be an art to be able to translate works well. I mean, even if we look at even things like Beowulf, which have been translated by numerous different translators, and there are different people who will say, "Well, I really like the Tolkien version versus the this other version," and so I think that that can definitely play a role in the translation, but it's still, yeah, it's just interesting to see how that process affects the individual translator, how much their voice comes into the actual work. So I think that's such an interesting point too.
Yeah, definitely. And just to echo exactly around what you just said, there's I love that there's a wide range of availability of translators in more translated fiction, more options or different texts by different translators are often available for older works, right? But even in those older works, you get to see that people have those preferences that they prefer one version versus the other. And it has to do with the translator themselves, what they took from the original text and how they translated it into the language that we're reading it in. And I just hope that, as the industry grows, that we get to see more translators and we get more text, more modern text, especially contemporary text translated by multiple people. I think that would be fantastic. And I know I'm not sure actually how much translators get paid or what the process of becoming a translator is. That's something I would love to learn more about because we need more of them. We just need
Yeah,
more translators.
yeah, absolutely. Absolutely.
I know you asked me about to introduce myself, and I touched a little bit about how I read translated fiction. And you said you were hesitant to read translated fiction. Now that you've read, you're almost done with Vita Nostra, and let me know if you've read any other translated fiction, but how have your thoughts evolved, or what are your thoughts now on translated fiction?
Oh, that's a good question. So, yeah, I mean, actually, it's interesting because I was very excited about reading Vita Nostra. And when I thought about it, actually, I have read quite a few translated books when I think about it. I mean, maybe not a ton, but I have read a few Japanese translated books. I recently read one that was translated from German. I've read Beowulf, which is obviously, a translated work. Yeah, I've read it. So I've read a few translated works, I think, not a ton, but I I think one thing that is really interesting to me about the whole process is just whenever I read a translated work is just taking in sort of the different sort of worldviews of that region of the world and sort of maybe the different approaches to social structures, to ways of life, and to yeah, just to daily life in general or to different worldviews. I think that that's been a big thing because I think that when we grow up in a certain society, we have certain ways of seeing the world, and we think everyone sees the world the way that we do, or that everyone thinks the same way about whether it's gender roles or whether it's social class issues or anything, and just to see some variety or just to see some different perspectives on anything is just interesting. Just to notice those little tiny differences are interesting, but also to notice the universals too, to notice that that there are similar experiences, there are similar universal themes that can resonate in different types of literature. So I think that that can be a huge value in seeing how that plays out in different types of books, even if they are translated from another language. So I always just find that fascinating. And I just think it's interesting also geographically to learn about a different part of the world and what that experience is like there based on the geography, based on the environment versus this part of the world. And I think that that can also be a big inspiration for different types of stories. But for example, I read the Witcher series,
Mhm.
and I think it was just really unique to see this different type of folklore and fantasy and different type of world building, even though fantasy is by nature a secondary world. It's just neat to see something that's, it has a different flavor of fantasy than what we're used to. So I always appreciate that. And I think that that can just generate a lot of inspiration, a lot of different conversation, and maybe even a lot of different ideas for new authors who are emerging and reading translated works. We're hearing about people who are inspired by other types of translated works, if that makes sense.
Yeah, it definitely does. And I also think it's fascinating to learn about geographical areas and the culture and the similarities and the differences. One thing that I also like is seeing the different approaches to storytelling and what the focus of the story is. I recently read back in, I want to say January or February, a book called Kalpa Imperial, and it's translated fantasy from Argentina, and it's just one of the most unique to me fantasy books that I've read, and it's because I haven't read anything else like it. The focus wasn't on the characters, it wasn't even on the plot. It was more of a thematic, very spanned out view of this world and this empire and how it kept falling and rising. And in a way, the storyteller was trying to find connections with why an empire rises and falls. But it was just so different that I found it fascinating. And I have never read such a book that was so detached from the characters. I'm a very character driven reader. Um, but that I still found so much fascination, and I loved it. It was so different, and even just that, I was like, wow, I want to read more fantasy books from Argentinian authors. And I don't know if there are many that write fantasy, but it was just a surreal and unique experience, and it was such a good book.
Oh, that is such a good point too about the narrative focus. And that's a great example too. That's a fantastic example. I know my friend Steve from the channel Steve Talks Books, he
Mhm.
recently read a book and interviewed an author, and I cannot remember who the author was or where the author was from, but the author was telling Steve that a lot of times that people, I think from the US maybe, that a lot of times we try to look for deeper meaning in the books that we read. In other words, looking for like deeper themes or subtext in the books that we're reading, or
Mhm.
metaphors, that kind of thing. And that the author was saying, but where I'm from, we don't really write that way. Like if we just write things as they are, and they're not supposed to necessarily have a subtext to it. And he thought that was very interesting. And so he actually even did a whole entire video about how we as readers maybe look for deeper meaning in books, or whether we do, and how that affects our reading experience if we're constantly trying to look for metaphors or deeper meaning, or whether we maybe just need to sit back and just take things as they are. And just that different approach to story, I think, is so interesting, because some stories are allegorical and sometimes they're not. And sometimes stories have a very absurdist quality. Like I know when I read Murakami's The Wind Up Bird Chronicle. Have you ever read any Murakami?
Not yet.
Yeah, okay. Yeah, I've only read that one book by him, but I right away got the impression like, okay, this is different than what I'm used to in literature. It's very, very, very different. So it's definitely a different approach. And I'm not sure I totally quote unquote got it, but I understand that there was intention behind doing things the way he did it. And so I think that there's a lot to learn from that. And I really appreciate that. I really appreciate that as a reader, learning to understand different ways or different approaches to a narrative, and that there isn't only one way of storytelling. There isn't one right way of storytelling. And I think we can learn a lot through translated works because of that.
I love that point of view. Yeah, I definitely agree. And I wanted to come back to a point that you made earlier. And wow, wait, I am so sorry. My mind just blinked.
Okay.
I wanted to, since you brought up that with Murakami, maybe you didn't necessarily get it. Do you think maybe that was a cultural thing? Maybe I wonder also how maybe someone who reads that book in that particular country, in that particular culture, interprets the story differently from those who are not in that particular country or culture. Do you think that there's some, I don't know, disconnect there, or some level of like nuance between what we as readers want to interpret based on our own culture, but maybe how that juxtaposes with the culture that it's written in.
That is such a good question. I would love to know an answer to that question because I feel like it gets a little bit challenging to figure that out sometimes because on the one hand, there might be really some fantastic analysis of that book where that can be explained through a cultural perspective. But then at the same time, I'm sure that you could also find books that are kind of a similar vein that were written in the US that maybe were kind of going for a similar kind of thing or from a different part of the world. And so at that point, it's like, is it cultural or is it just a different, like a very specific type of storytelling? And is that more prominent in Japan than it is here? So
Yeah.
those kinds of questions are interesting for me. And I'd love to learn more about that personally. I know when I read a manga called Orange that I've talked about on my channel a little bit last year. It was the first manga I had ever read. And it's kind of like a contemporary YA manga that has to do with these kids who receive letters from the future about a boy that they know is going to take his life by suicide. And the letters from the future are about how to prevent that from happening. And I know that when that came out on book two, when people were reading it in YA circles, because I think it's more kind of a YA contemporary manga, not necessarily fantasy, which is what I typically read. But I
Mhm.
know when people were talking about it a few years ago, they were kind of caught up on that particular manga, maybe sending some unhealthy messages about how much of a role friendship has in somebody making that decision. And I thought that was really interesting because I could kind of see both sides of that. And I could also see maybe like from being in, I've only visited Japan once, but
Yeah.
I did get a greater sense of people having a certain, um, I felt like there was like a greater sense of understanding of other people and a greater respect for space of other people and wanting to think of the whole rather than your individual needs. And I think I've heard about that too, even with traffic there. And I could be wrong about this, so I apologize if I'm misspeaking or if I'm misunderstanding anything about Japanese culture, but I have heard that people are more likely to let people in a traffic, whereas here people are just ready to cut other people off at all costs. And so it's much less aggressive in that sense and much more thinking about the whole, thinking about the community as a whole and about their interconnection than maybe over here. And again, I apologize if I'm misunderstanding anything about that because I'm not an expert, but it did make me think when I was reading that book and about the role of friendship and about trying to make a difference in other people's lives. And maybe that was a different interpretation of community, of friendship, of connection than what we understand here as being a very individualistic kind of society. So those kinds of questions come up for me, I think, when I'm reading a translated work.
Definitely. And that even goes back to us not necessarily trying to find deeper meaning in books, but noticing themes. And it's just from that difference, right? Just noticing, well, hey, that's an interesting approach to what, or that's a different perspective that I haven't maybe necessarily encountered, or maybe a different take on something that is so universal, such as friendships or, you know, or impacting others around you. So that's primarily one of the reasons that I just love translated fiction is that you never really know what you're going to get, if that makes sense, because you haven't, or I haven't, especially when I read a new translated fiction from a new country to me, I often have to go and do research afterwards because there's either historical context or there's some words that can't be translated when there's sometimes even like food mentioned. And I have to go and look it up and get more context for me to feel like I'm thoroughly understanding the story.
Yeah, exactly. I think that that context really adds a dimension to it. So, yeah, and I think that maybe that's also why people are afraid of reading translated works too, is they feel like, well, then I'm going to be responsible for having to understand all the context and things like that. But But I still think it's worth, trying to stretch yourself, even if even if you can't understand everything, right?
I agree. And, I think part of the reason too that people may not want to read translated fiction is, like you said, knowing more of a context, but also for some reason, picking up translated fiction feels like you're picking up a textbook in a sense, or at least that's how I felt like when I originally started reading translated fiction. It didn't feel like just a consumable story or escapism. It felt like, oh, I'm picking up something new that I'm going to learn, and it felt like I was trying to take a class or trying to pick up a textbook. And I don't know, maybe that was only my experience, but it just felt like not escapism, which I know is the reason why a lot of people read. But the more that I sift and the more through translated works and the more that I consume more of them, it's like, no, they're easily digestible stories. Yeah, and like Steve learned from that interview, sometimes there isn't that deeper meaning. Sometimes the story is just a story and it's just meant to be enjoyed. And I think as people start to learn more about translated learn that more about translated fiction, I think it's not as daunting anymore. It's sort of the approach that people have with classics, like, oh, I can't read a classic because of the language, or maybe it's a little bit too difficult, it's not escapism. But there are classics that are easily consumable. So I just hope that people start to delve more into and learn that there are stories out there that are easily digestible and it's just a story.
Yeah. And I want to shout out Vita Nostra, the book that we're reading this month, because of that, because I honestly, I I wouldn't even know really that it was a translated work, honestly. I mean, there are certain aspects, obviously, of the region. There probably are some things that, and I hope we could talk about that when we have our discussion, whether we noticed anything that was very specific to that region or that would point out anything that would, highlight that it's a translated work. Because honestly, I just think it's a fantastic story so far. And I just feel very, very immersed in it, very connected to the characters. And yeah, I don't know that I would even know it was translated, honestly.
That's a huge like point, that we may be reading books and we may not even know they're translated and we can just easily enjoy them. But I'm really excited for Vita Nostra, and just seeing your excitement for it, I'm like, yes, this is going to be a good one.
Absolutely. This is going to be a great one. And I just hope that if you're watching this video, that you'll consider joining us, that you'll consider reading Vita Nostra, because I know I had heard exceptional praise for this book even before you invited me. Our friend Ola, the channel Wild Witch, it was her favorite book of 2021. She named it her favorite book of 2021. My friend Matt from the channel Books Rebound, who is a huge Malazan fan. He's a huge fan of the Malazan Book of the Fallen. He's read that series several times. He has said that Vita Nostra is one of his favorite books of all time. I think he said it was his favorite book of all time. I could be mistaken that, but I know he loves it and he couldn't say enough good things about it. And that there have been several other people who have said that they love this book and it made it to favorite lists and things like that. So it's actually been very well received. And also, it's interesting too. It's something that I think could appeal to people. I know a lot of people love dark academia. If you love dark
Mhm.
academia, I think this would be a great recommendation, or magical realism, or something with a really deep psychological story where you're
Mhm.
really deep into the character's mind and seeing a character transform. If you're a character driven reader, highly recommend this story. And it's also interesting that it's translated, because while I'm reading it, I know I'm doing a huge pitch for this book, but really it's good. Uh, One thing I'm noticing is I can almost picture it in my mind as sort of like an indie film, or as sort of like some sort of interesting indie surreal cinematic TV series or something, because I could just visualize everything that the authors are writing about. So I guess that speaks to a very good translator and very good authors and great story.
Definitely. I like I said, I haven't started the book yet, but you just made me want to start it today.
Wonderful. Yay. Well, that's the goal. So, so yeah. Is there any last thing you want to say about translated works or thoughts on this topic?
I wanted to touch base on something that actually you just mentioned, how Vita Nostra has a little bit of everything, right? It's fantasy, but it has a little bit of dark academia, and it might have some like thriller tropes with a psychological, um, following that the cycle. What am I trying to say? With like a psychological approach, and I wonder, we have very specific genres and buckets that we as readers gravitate to, right? Like fantasy, sci-fi, literary fiction. But what about works that could potentially be that are translated that don't potentially fit into those very strict genres that we create here? I wonder if kind of like magical realism, right? Like magical realism didn't start here, it started somewhere else, and then we slowly fell in love with magical realism as a genre. So I just wonder as well if maybe there are genres out there that are not here that we don't even know about, or if it's just the nature of translated works to be a little bit genre bending because they don't necessarily try to fit within those buckets.
That's a really good question. That's a really good question because I know I just mentioned Murakami's book earlier.
Mhm.
I don't know if that could be considered, I don't know if, I guess that's kind of magical realism. And this book, it's interesting. It's definitely kind of like a magical realism slash fantasy. I would say more magical realism, but
Yeah.
on the spectrum of fantasy anyway.
Hmm.
But yeah, just I really wonder where the origins of that come from, or if it's something that, maybe originated in several places, and just came about in different ways. I'd be curious about that as well. So that's a good question.
Me too. I'm going to do some research. Maybe we can talk a little bit more about that during the live show.
Absolutely. Wonderful. Well, Alicia, thank you so much for joining me. This was a wonderful discussion. And I'm so excited to discuss Vita Nostra with you on April 23rd on your channel. And I'm so excited for your book club, the Lit in Translation Book Club. So definitely check out Alicia's channel if you haven't already. And I'll, of course, leave the link in the description. So thank you so much.
Thank you, Joanna. I just wanted to say that I'm really grateful for you reaching out to me and wanting to have this discussion. I adore your channel, and what I adore the most about you is that you always support the people that you care about, and I just I feel an immense love from you, and I've never felt so supported from anyone. So I just
Oh, it's my pleasure. It's absolutely my pleasure. Happy to do so. So thank you all so much for watching and have a great rest of your day. Bye bye.